This is the infamous Deer Story, written and performed by me, Jeff Morgan. Performed January 29, 2025 at the Delray Beach Playhouse for their Tell Me a Story show. The statute of limitations for my story is 6 years. The story starts in Springfield, Ohio, in the fall of 1978. It doesn't end in Springfield, but it does end in the fall of 1978, so I think I'm good. I was studying English at Ohio University in Athens, and my friend, Ranger X, so called because he should have been a forest ranger, was studying forestry at Hocking Technical College, although he could never ever dream of landing a job with the Forestry Service because he had a record. He got popped while we were in high school for selling weed out of the trunk of his car in a city park. He had this huge 1967 lime green Pontiac Bonneville. He'd park it at the park. Somebody'd come up to the driver's side window. He'd get out of the car, walk the expanse of the Bonneville back to the trunk, open the trunk. An exchange would take place. Close the trunk, walk back to the front seat, sit down, wait for somebody else to knock on the window. I mean, it was obvious, right? So you may be surprised to learn that I agreed to join Ranger X in one of his plans to make some serious cash selling weed. We were a couple of poor potheads. Both of our fathers died when we were young. We bonded over that. Ranger X had a plan. He knew a deal where we could each get a free ounce of weed and each make $120. That's good money in those days. We'd buy 2 pounds of weed. I'd sell a pound in Athens, he'd sell a pound in Nelsonville. We'd spend a weekend in Springfield, pick up the weed on a Sunday, drive back to Athens where we would break it up and bag it for sale. Ranger X would spend the night in Athens and get up early to drive back to Nelsonville. He had a class he didn't want to miss. He was talking about it a lot. They were going to learn how to determine the sex of a beaver if they could find one. Though the leaves were changing color that fall weekend in Springfield, Ohio, nothing really changed in Springfield, Ohio in those days. We had on our jean jackets, flannel shirts, blue jeans, boots, baseball hats, had our long hair. We picked up the weed on a Sunday afternoon, put it in the trunk, and went to go eat. It was around 5 p.m. when we ambled into a Perkins Pancake House and had breakfast for dinner. After wolfing down our pancakes and sausage, we drove through a drive-thru to pick up a 6-pack of fire brewed Strohs for our drive. Ranger X reckoned it'd take around 3 hours. We took a road less traveled, running south of Columbus to avoid the state troopers and the general hubbub of the interstate. In fact, it wasn't far outside of Springfield that Ranger X pulled off I-70, just south of Lake Choctaw, about 6 p.m. With the sun setting behind us, we're heading down State Route 56, which will take us directly into Athens, although the last part of our journey will be in the dark on the windy, twisty roads of the Wayne National Forest. We're cruising in Ranger X's massive Pontiac Bonneville that has a battering ram for a grill that's in another zip code from the dashboard, an interior cabin that could house a party of us and 6 cheerleaders, and a cavernous trunk, which is where we put the weed. We're smoking our profits, drinking as the world grew darker and we crossed into the forest. Ranger X is blasting Aerosmith on 8-track. We're joking, laughing, dreaming about the free ounce of weed we're each going to get and the $120 we're each going to make. That's $580 today. Now, it was somewhere in between New Plymouth and New Marshfield where it happened. I'd bent down to try to find some weed I'd spilled, and Ranger X had turned on the interior cabin light. And I bolted up right quick when he hit the brakes hard, and there was a deer coming into the headlights on the left, and boom! Impact! And we come to a stop, and the deer goes flying into some tall grasses on the right side of the road. We looked at one another wide-eyed, mouths agape, and knew we had to go check on that deer. So Ranger X put it in park, kept the engine running, kept Aerosmith blasting, and we walked into the headlights, and there it was, a young buck. And then it writhed up out of the tall grasses and sank back down into him. And we looked at one another silently, and then it flailed up out of the tall grasses again and sank back down into him. And we looked at one another with a shared kind of gloom. Finally, Ranger X spoke. I wish I had my gun. And you know, it's one of the only times I can think of when it made sense to have one, to shoot this poor animal, to put this pitiful creature out of its pain and suffering. And it was right about then that a forest ranger pulled up behind the Bonneville in his truck and came walking towards us. "What's the problem, boys?" Ranger X knew him from class, called his memory, and they had their moment of recognition while I was ready to do you-know-what off to the side. "Hit a deer," was all Ranger X said. "Let's go take a look," said the forest ranger, but before any of us could take a step, it writhed up out of the tall grasses again and sank back down into him. And we all three looked at one another without speaking, and then it flailed up out of the tall grasses again and sank back down into him. "Kill it!" I screamed, and I was losing my cool, and Ranger X had to settle me down, and he more calmly asked the forest ranger if he could please shoot the poor creature, and the forest ranger responded that he could not. "What do you mean you can't shoot it?" I was definitely losing my cool, and Ranger X had to calm me down some more, and the forest ranger added, "I can't shoot it, but I can club it." Ranger X and I looked at one another kind of stupefied, and in unison, in a resigned kind of fashion, said, "Okay, club it." So the forest ranger walked silently back to his truck and came walking back silently with his club and walked up where that deer was in the headlights, and it writhed up, almost hooved him, and when it was down in the tall grasses, he was on it and he was beating on it. And when he had his fill, he backed up kind of exhausted like, and then it flailed up out of the tall grasses again. And when it was down, he was back on it. And we were watching this scene play out in the headlights, the Ranger X's Pontiac Bonneville, surrounded by the deep dark of the Wayne National Forest, with Aerosmith blasting in the background and 2 pounds of weed in the trunk. After he'd had his fill this time, he staggered back kind of exhausted like, and sure enough, it flailed up out of those tall grasses again and sank back down into him. And he turned around and looked at us, and we looked at him, and we all knew what had to be done. So without speaking, he walked back to his truck and came walking back silently with his rifle and walked up to where that deer was in the headlights, and it writhed up out of those tall grasses once, and when it was back down in him, he was on it and shot it in the head. Turned around and looked at us and said, "Okay, let's put it in the trunk." Talk about your moments of silent recognition, but Ranger X was smooth, like a good host with visitors, and gave us both something to do. Told me to go get the keys out of the ignition, go open that trunk, there were towels back there, get it ready for the deer. Asked the forest ranger to help him carry the carcass back to the trunk. Well, I didn't need to be told twice, so I rushed back to the car, got those keys out of the ignition, ran back to that trunk, fumbled with the lock what seemed like an eternity, finally opened the trunk, and there was that weed. 2 pounds, a pound each in a baggie, together in a larger baggie, and there were towels back there. So I tossed the weed into a corner of the trunk, threw a towel over it, and then looked around the expanse of the Bonneville, and here they come with the deer. And so I tossed the towel down on the floor of the trunk, and there they were, and they plopped the deer down on the towel, and Ranger X shut the trunk. Forest ranger took our names and some pertinent information about us and the Bonneville and said, "Happy eating." Walked back to his truck and drove away. I handed the keys back to Ranger X, and we sat back in the front seat. He started up the engine, cranked up Aerosmith, put it into gear, and without speaking, we drove off too.